a esta sesión
Good
sobre
morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on the key impacts for Latin America and the Caribbean of the report by Work Group 2 within the Global Report on the Assessment of Climate Change by the IPCC. This is a joint event between the UN Program for the Environment and the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, very tied to analyzing the results of this report in our region, in Latin America. Unfortunately, the dramatic events of the last week of the invasion of Ukraine have not allowed giving a the proper attention that such a fundamental issue deserved for the planet and for our region. This war in Ukraine with clear links to climate change due to the energy system in Europe, still very dependent on gas and oil, has dulled somehow the sharing of these uh, messages so that people can analyze the implications. This is the goal precisely of the session. This will be a session where we'll have different authors, different specifically for this work group 2 report. Let's remember that it is part of a continuum of reports. The first was presented in the month of last August 2021, where it was where there was mention of the latest progress in climate science, and where it was direct where a red alert was launched for humanity, were the words of the Secretary General. The next report, the third one, which will be presented in approximately a month, will have to do with the mitigation options for climate change, and we also hope to be able to share with you folks those chief implications for our region when that is presented. Now back to the issue of the report we'll be presenting today from Work Group 2, centered on the impact on adaptation and on the vulnerability of climate change. The Secretary General has described that as an Attila of human suffering, a condemnable failed climate leadership. And in the special session of the Forum of Ministers of the Environment of Latin America and the Caribbean that took place approximately a month ago in San Jose, everyone was reminded of the importance, of the vital importance that adaptation to climate change has for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the importance of complying with the Glasgow Accord at least at 50% for all the funds directed to climate change and adaptation, given the priority need for the region. And without further ado, I'd like to let Carlos Mendez speak, and he'll open for us in representation of the IPCC. Go ahead, Mr. Carlos. Thank you very much. Well, firstly, just my gratitude to the UN Program for the Environment for organizing this event on the results of Working Group 2. As you have mentioned, their focus is to assess impact, vulnerability, and adaptation, and this time in its sixth assessment on climate change. Now, this comes from yeah, the conclusion of the general conclusion of this report is that scientific evidence, cumulative scientific evidence, has confirmed that climate change is without a doubt a threat for human well-being and for the health of the planet. And any further delay in concerted global action, negotiated concerted global action amongst countries in the world, entails losing the opportunity to have an ecologically sound future. So on this issue, we are going to go more in depth with the panelists today, whom I also thank for their response to our invitation. And On behalf of the IPCC, I welcome all of you, and I hope that we have a very productive session. Thank you. Thank you very much, Carlos Mendez, who, just to orient you, he's Vice President for South America and Central America for this Working Group 2 of the IPCC. And in addition to that, he's General Coordinator for the Regional Center for the Study and Use of Savannas in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. So thank you, Mr. Carlos. And we'll have the opportunity also to speak to you afterwards about these specific impacts in South America, the impact of this report. And so now I'd like to go on to the four authors who will provide details very, very briefly, obviously, because we'd like to cover so many topics that the report mentions. But the first author is Deborah Lay, as she is author of the report, but also an official for economic affairs concerning energy and natural resources for FEPAL in Mexico. So go ahead, Deborah. Thank you so much. Very good day to all. Thank you very much for the invitation, for helping us to disseminate the information of this report. I think that among the results, the chief results that we've obtained is that the impacts we are seeing will become more and more severe as the levels of global warming increase. So in the region, for example, the pattern of hurricanes and floods or droughts will continue to increase, leading to problems both in urban centers as well as in human settlements in rural areas that will also entails water safety and food safety problems. But in the launching discourse, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, also mentioned that adaptation saves lives. And that is something we find in the report, that there are options for adaptation that are effective, that it is the first time that this feasibility, this intersector, regional and global analysis is carried out for the various options, and that we need to take advantage of these options while we still can. And I say while we can, because as the global temperature increases, the level of global warming increases, there are some systems that will be reaching their limits. And limits means that they will undergo changes that may be reversible and maybe not. One example of limits of non-reversible thresholds has to do with the loss of coral reefs, but we can also see that in some ecosystems, in the loss of species that are placed under risk, under endangerment of extinction. So the report shows that there are over 3 billion people that are highly vulnerable. These adaptation measures can save the lives of these people. They can help save some of the ecosystems that are currently in the critical state. But to do that, we need to act now. Because if we wait more time, that these systems can be lost to the degree that we increase the levels of global warming. The other thing that that the report mentions is that work needs to be done to head toward resilient trajectories for climate. And this means that although adaptation can indeed save lives, adaptation can't do everything because we also depend on mitigation. We rely on the mitigation to limit the levels of global warming. We need to reduce emissions that, as Gustavo well mentioned, in a month we will be getting a report from group 3, but it is important for the adaptation and vulnerability part of it because normally we can go much more in depth as far as thresholds and limits and when we have reached changes that will be irreversible. But we also need to work jointly on the issue, bearing in mind that there are activities that reduce emissions but that increase vulnerability. just like there are options that reduce vulnerability, but that can increase emissions. So these pathways for resilient development to resist climate change entail adaptation and mitigation for in the search for sustainable development. And so we're looking for adaptation, mitigation, sustainable development that at least looking toward 2030, we will focus on development, on sustainable development. Something that's very important that is highlighted in this report is the role that values play, the various types of knowledge, equity, equality, and climate justice, that resilient, resilient paths, journeys are choices we make as a society, meaning that every single one of us plays a role, and we need to bring the more vulnerable ones to the table, those on the fringes, and to take advantage of and use indigenous knowledge and ancestral knowledge. And this way, we can manage to save these people who are in a state of high vulnerability, including their ecosystems. Now, as a last message, it would be that there is a relationship between nature and human beings, that we can't watch over only the well-being of human beings, but also for the health of the planet and of the ecosystems, because we depend on healthy ecosystems. We rely on them to be able to survive. Thank you. Thank you very much, Deborah, for giving us such a quick vision, this quick zoom into the impacts of this report for our region. And I would now like to go over to the Caribbean. We have Michelle Meku, who is an author as well of this report, and she coordinates the chapter on the small islands in this working group 2 of the IPCC. She's also a professor of urban planning and development in the Department of Geomatic Engineering and Land Use Planning at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. So welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you.
Tengo una pregunta.
So I have a question for you, Michelle. These small islands are hotspots, right? They're hotspots for climate change. So based on this report, what are the key risks that have been detected for small islands, and very specifically for the Caribbean?
Yes. So yes, you are right. We've often been described as biodiversity hotspots based on the impacts of climate change in the Caribbean region. We have already been experiencing changes in climate change. For example, temperature increases, more intense tropical cyclones, as we know them in the Caribbean, as hurricanes. We've been seeing storm surges, and we've been seeing the combined effects of changing precipitation patterns and sea level rise amongst the lower lying islands, in so far as we're seeing flooding. But we have observed these impacts, but more importantly, we are concerned about the future risks that climate change poses for us. And in the small islands, some of the future risks include more flooding. This is likely due to sea level rise over the next 2 decades. We will, in fact, actually see a doubling in the frequency of floods in many islands. And we also, based on the assessment report, have found that there is a likelihood that we will experience more intense tropical cyclones, which will be the major driving factor of flooding, certainly in the Caribbean. And we've already seen the effects of category 4 and 5 hurricanes occurring annually in the Caribbean. A particular concern for us in terms of future risks is the concentration of population, economic assets, and infrastructure on our low-lying coastlines. Some islands are very mountainous, and therefore settlement patterns have historically been focused on the low-lying coastal plains. but that's the area that is vulnerable to sea level rise, to tropical storms and the associated storm surges. And in fact, some of the data we found showed that in some cases, more than 50% of our population is concentrated in this low elevation coastal zone, which is an area about 10 meters elevation in the coastal zone itself. So for us, we are concerned about the safety of people, our economic assets, and our critical infrastructure, which is so important for economic development. It's no secret that we are a biodiversity hotspot globally, and the assessment shows that we can actually face an extinction risk of about 100% of endemic species throughout insular biodiversity hotspots, which would include the Caribbean and some of my Pacific and Indian Ocean counterparts. And that can happen if the temperature goes beyond 3 degrees Celsius. And in some cases, we are already seeing with the loss of coral reefs, 70 to 90% of coral reefs already damaged due to coral reef bleaching because of the warming of the ocean and ocean acidification. That has serious consequences for us in terms of the vulnerability of our tourism sector and the fisheries sector. We are already facing drought and changes in terms of our freshwater resources, and that's likely to be more at risk if there's saline intrusion occurring because of sea level rise. What that has implications for would be food security, water security, human health and well-being. Those are critical concerns for us. And we are already seeing that a 1% degree increase, a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature can actually see 60% of the people of the Caribbean affected by severe water resource stress, somewhere between 2043 to 2071. So it's not the short term, but projected risks would be in that area. And I would answer the last part of your question. The loss and damages that we suffer is of a magnitude that sometimes derails our economic development. So in many cases, we've had hurricanes of magnitude 4 and 5 categories in the region. And that has led to sometimes more than 200% of GDP loss due to that extreme event. And if it happens annually, there is very little chance of recovering from these kinds of devastating impacts. And that has all been based on the assessment report that we just concluded.
Muchísimas gracias, Michelle. Y si nos tuviera que decir opciones.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And if you could give us some chief options for adaptation in Caribbean islands, what would these be?
Right. So adaptation is a requirement for small island developing states. As you know, our carbon footprints are small, but we have to adapt to what is happening globally. And for us, we have to consider seawalls as a form of coastal defense. Caribbean islands have done it before. In Havana, you know, you have the Malecon protecting Havana. You have in Guyana, we've seen the seawalls built by the Dutch and so on. So it's nothing new to us, keeping the sea out of our coastal plains. But it's going to be a measure that is required, a hard engineering measure. In some cases, we can do accommodation, which is to sometimes look at the elevation of buildings in the floodplains. That means retrofitting buildings and building to new building standards and codes. And as a very, very last resort, we will have to retreat from the coastline. And it involves relocation of settlements inland. Now, that's a challenge for a small island state where you have a limited land stock. How do you keep displacing people from the coastline? But as I say, I should say with emphasis, there is no single adaptation measure. They will have to be combined. And so we are seeing also efforts to consider ecosystem-based adaptation, which may in fact be more sustainable in the form of mangrove replanting, watershed management, and so on. Our key challenge really is how to develop an institutional framework that is fit for purpose in the Caribbean, to be responsive to the adaptation challenges. How do we deal with informal settlements when so many of these settlements exist outside the regulatory planning framework? How do you come in after the fact and retrofit buildings not built according to codes? We will obviously have to explore building capacity, human resource capacity to do research, modeling. Some of the data requirements for our assessment was in fact, it was challenged by the lack of hard modeling and the paucity of data. But we did our best to extrapolate from the research that we had. And so we have to build technical capacity in that area. And I would say that we need to embed in our local population the full awareness that we are highly vulnerable and that we face an existential threat due to climate change. And action is very, very urgent, not at the global scale only, but at a regional level and at the local level. All hands must be on deck if we are, as part of one planet, if we are going to be able to survive the threats and the risks that are forecasted from the climate change. Yeah. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for this such a, I would say, you know, just urgent vision of all the challenges we're facing that are already here, but that have truly been made much clearer in this future-facing report that addresses the Caribbean. Now, I would like to be able to go on to another sub-region also, very important, a very affected one nowadays, which is due to climate change. I would like to let Mr. Edwin Castellanos, who's also an author of co-author of the report. He's coordinator of the chapter on Central America and South America. He is also director of the Economic Observatory for the Sustainable Economic Observatory in Guatemala for the El Valle University, and he's an expert on Central America and on climate change in this sub-region also that's been so affected. So thank you so much for being with us. And my first question would be, what impact and risks, what chief impacts and risks, in addition to the ones we already knew about, but what other new things are coming as far as impact in Central America? Now, thank you for the question and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here sharing with my colleagues from the IPCC and with all who are listening to us. As far as your question is concerned, I have to point out that, as in the case of islands, the region of Central America is considered a hotspot as far as vulnerability. And in general, where risk is concerned, because we have a high exposure to extreme events, just like the islands do. And in that sense, the climate change impacts of climate change are already observable in the region, especially as far as the variability of precipitation is concerned. What we have is basically an impact of rain on, particularly for small-scale farmers who rely on this rain to water their fields. So in that sense, we've observed that, especially in the last decade, that rainfall at the beginning of the rain season are diminishing, and farmers who are used to sowing in April have often lost their crops due to the fact that the rain that normally would have arrived in May is no longer arriving, or is arriving in a very small amount. Generally then, this impact in food production for small farmers has been very noticeable, and also the impact as far as the lack of water again, at the end of this period, when of this dry season and when the rainy season starts. And then we have the opposite too, which is we have these extreme rain events, tropical storms, even hurricanes that affect the region. And in that sense, these rainfall extremes bring with them not just flooding, but also uh, runoff. And this has an erosion. And this has led to not just economic losses, but also human lives lost in the region. And then lastly, the other sector where one can see an impact of climate change is the healthcare sector, specifically when it comes to diseases transmitted by vectors. And here, the chief driver is increase in temperature. What we are seeing then is that particularly for mosquito-borne diseases such as dengue and malaria or Zika. These are expanding their area of occurrence and they are being much more intense when it comes to epidemics. In fact, in areas such as Guatemala City, where I'm located, up until a couple of decades ago, it was very, very rare, almost impossible really to hear of dengue. And now, well, dengue is practically endemic in this region, where we're looking at a high region where 1,500 meters above sea level. Normally, mosquitoes weren't able to thrive in this region, but with the increase in temperature, now we are finding them here. This is with regard to impact on human systems, to summarize, because I know time is limited, but I also wanted to mention impact on ecosystems. In Central America, as in the case of the Caribbean, we have uh, a very important barrier reef. In fact, it's the second biggest on the planet after Australia. And this barrier reef, this coral reef, is being strongly impacted by climate change. The coral reef is one of the most sensitive ecosystems, not just to climate, to temperature, water temperature change, but also to any change in acidity that can come from CO2 in the atmosphere being dissolved in the water. Of course, climate change is not the only factor that is affecting this coral reefs. We also have lots of contamination that is runoff from the fields to the ocean. So reefs that are found on the coast of Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras are being strongly impacted, not just by this contamination, this human contamination, but also by climate change. In addition to that, the other ecosystem that is being impacted and where we hope that, and where we are expecting it to be impacted, is the tropical rainforest in the region. We, the we're expecting that the Petén region in Guatemala, together next to Belize and Mexico, they have an extensive tropical forest, and we have the same situation in Honduras, bordering Nicaragua, where you see that forests are being affected by droughts that are more and more intense over the years. And so it is important now, speaking not just of the present, but of the future, to understand that climate models, climate for the Central American region, show that as the century progresses, rainfall will diminish, and therefore the region will become drier. This means that forests, lowland forests that are currently receiving enough rain, will become drier and drier over time, and obviously their productivity will drop. Concretely, these models show that the so-called dry corridor that has received a lot of attention in the Central American region, as the century progresses, this dry corridor will continue expanding its size, and it will become more and more impactful, and as will the drought risk in the region. Interestingly, in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, in that part of Central America, that is a region where we have the greatest number of populations. So the amount of people affected in these regions is, and it is expected it will be a large amount of people in the future. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Edwin. And in this, with this looking at this landscape, at with this in mind, how could Central American communities adapt vis-a-vis this great number of impacts? Well, adaptation is definitely a challenge for the region, uh, partly because the high vulnerability of the region comes from high levels of poverty, high levels of basic uh, uh, living conditions. So this means that governments in the region have that commitment or are faced with this situation at any rate of reducing poverty, uh, while at the same time working on these adaptation processes. So there's definitely adaptation in our region, as was mentioned for the islands, is strongly limited by the institutional capacity and by the availability of financial resources. And so, in that sense, small countries such as Central American countries and insular countries, we are always in need of having compliance with what was agreed in the Paris Accords, the financing by developed countries to support us in these adaptation actions. Having said that, and now specifically addressing what actions can be taken in the region, well, we mentioned that one of the biggest problems for small farmers is this variation in rain, this variability in rainfall and the overall reduction in rainfall. And it's important to point out that Central America has abundant rainfall. The problem is that it's concentrated in 5 or 6 months out of the year. So meaning we spend a good while without rain, but then when it rains enough. So it is a first step is for small farmers is small scale farmers. It definitely for those who depend on this rainfall for their crops is to be able to store water in during the seasons that we do have abundant rain, and this would have to come tied with implementing irrigation systems that at the end of the day are relatively simple systems that aren't very expensive. So maybe there the biggest challenge is not so much the money, but being able to reach each and every one of these small farmers, because obviously they run into the millions if we add up the whole region. So that's something about the food production issue specifically for small scale farmers. Now, I also mentioned the impact of extreme events, uh, so tropical storm events, hurricanes specifically. And so in that sense, we definitely need to improve our early warning systems. And more than just improving the early warning system, we need to improve our reaction capability for alerts that are issued. For example, when 2 years ago we had the Eta and Iota hurricanes in the region, we knew that the hurricanes were coming. In fact, obviously, hurricanes are not events that happen overnight. Of course, you can see in the news that a hurricane is coming and that it's approaching Central America. So the authorities knew that the hurricanes were approaching the region. Big part of the problem was the lack of capability to get populations to prepare for the impact of these tropical storms. Unlike, say, for example, countries such as the United States, where one sees a rapid response of moving the population away from the possible point of impact for the hurricane. Here in Central America, it happens that the hurricane is coming and the population remains in the place, and then they face the full force of that storm. So definitely we need to improve the early warning system, but also the capacity to react so as to be able to get the population to safety in a place where it's less risky. Obviously, again, this requires resources, this requires institutional capabilities that need to be strengthened in the region. At the end of the day,
Tal vez un último punto que quiero mencionar.
one
ya lo
last
había-
item I could mention, and I had, and Debbie had mentioned in her intervention, in her, the northern part of Guatemala, where I'm located, is rich in indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge. And this knowledge, this know-how is going to become very important to use it as a basis for adaptation, especially when it comes to small-scale farmers local farmers in the region have been cultivating in these mountains, not hundreds, but thousands of years, obviously under more stable climate conditions. But now we need to combine this know-how, the know-how that these cultures have accumulated over these last few centuries with the scientific, the more recent scientific knowledge, so as to be able to help them to work with these climate changes. So definitely, as has already been said, adaptation cannot be thought of as just coming from one single sector or one single institution. We can't think of just governments being responsible. We need to think of governments working together with the private sector, working together with communities. And at the end of the day, it's very important to ensure that the message arrives, that reaches everyone. And I think that's why it's been very important to have the emphasis that the IPCC has placed on communication of the results of this report. And these sorts of this sort of events is very important to multiply so that the message reaches the entire population. The better informed the population is, the better trained they will be to face these changes. Thank you. Thank you so much for that extraordinary summary of the Central American situation. And I would now like to go back to Mr. Carlos Mendez to address the other great subregion of our continent, which is South America. And specifically, Mr. Carlos, the the South American population, and this is a common knowledge. It's common for the whole continent, but it's more and more becoming an urban population, and we seem to be the second continent that has the greatest number of city dwellers in the planet. So, what are going to be the impacts in the cities, and what are the options for citizens to adapt? Okay, that's an excellent question, and but part of the impact in the cities, it's very important. However, I don't want to go too in depth just into the cities without mentioning that we should not lose that comprehensive vision of what the system is because cities are closely tied to the non-city populations, the rural areas, and the and the wild parts that support the cities, and so I'll answer the question. Well, basically, the cities, as as was mentioned, the chief types of impact that they'll have is that they're these changes will affect the lives of citizens, and this has to do with extremes, mainly with torrential rains, with the risk of flooding, of runoff, of landslides, of overstepping or trespass or reaching beyond the capability of water management, of being able to channel water in cities that also have high probabilities of fires. That some of these can come from natural sources and go into the cities, and depending on the temperature, we can you can you can see it in the city, and there can be control for that. So what we've observed at any rate, and what the evidence in the report shows, is that the key adaptation measures to date have to do with infrastructure that will address these impacts, the infrastructure for containing runoff, for channeling water, infrastructure for somehow or other be able to hold these impacts back. But these are not all the options we face. We have not all options have to do with infrastructure. We have some adaptation measures that, uh, as Debbie was mentioning, as Deborah was mentioning, have to do with governance, inclusion, inclusiveness, and equality, because measures don't always get to mitigate uh, effects and lead and don't always lead to us adapting fully, uh, but rather these adaptation measures can produce, on the one hand, they can, yes, they can lead to poor adaptation or non-adaptation. They may reduce the risks in some areas, but can have collateral effects that may increase vulnerability in other contexts. For example, we can increase capability for managing water by placing dams or dikes in certain water bodies, but in some cases, this can also lead to a risk for the biological system, a risk for the natural ground cover that is also associated to that water resource, linked to that water resource. So in some cases, adaptation can be negatively affected, and also so when it comes to this integration of different ways of mitigating and adapting, in the search of sustainable development, uh, our goal is to have this ability to adapt, to develop sustainably. This is what we in the report we call climate resilient development, that we call it CRD by its English initials. Carlos? Sorry, Carlos. I'm so sorry. Just on this idea, uh, so on the heterogeneity of impacts and the in the urban context, but also looking at the peri-urban regions, all of the ecosystems that surround the city. What options do you see for adaptation plans at the country level to be able to be coordinated, given that there are shared ecosystems and given that there are sectors that are, for example, ideal for neighboring countries? Well, right. One of those opportunities that we have, say, for example, for regional coordination, have to do with cities, because cities give us an excellent opportunity to set into motion and to design this climate resilient development system. And in the cities, particularly, we can implement measures that have to do with governance, inclusiveness, and equality or equity. So, given despite that heterogeneity of sources of impact, I would say even uh, given the adaptive capability that we have throughout the region, those key risks that are common to the region, to the Caribbean, to Central America, and to South America, that have to do with water security, food security, vector-borne diseases, uh, runoff, flooding, storms, and the possibility of having large fires. So in those sectors, and when taking those impacts into account, we have an opportunity for integration and collaboration regionally to be able to attack these impacts and be able to have collaboration among various countries in the region, be it for obtaining financing, for using this financing that was meant that Edwin mentioned as crucial, as well as by joint implementation of adaptation measures. Thank you very much, Mr. Carlos, for this such an integrating vision of the outlook. I'd like to now go back to close this session for introductions. So prior to the questions that we could get from you folks. Deborah, if you could please, I'd like to ask you, Carlos already mentioned it here, this ecosystem-based adaptation, the solutions based on nature. We've already seen a little bit of that catalytic role that these can play for ecosystems to get adaptation. Could you go further into depth on what this report is telling us on this kind of solutions? Of course, thank you. Well, firstly, we have options. So, for example, as far as forests are concerned, that affect protection and conservation of and measures for restoration. Now, as far as other kinds of ecosystems, there for the protection of biodiversity, there are various corridors, bio corridors for appropriate regions, such as depending on where the increase in temperature is projected to go. But for example, we have seen that the movement of species can help connect different protected regions. Now, as far as, for example, urban systems or other kinds of settlements that are not large cities, we have there are options based, for example, on planting more trees and green areas, of having green roofs that can reduce the effects of these heat islands, and also use nature for a better management of water resources. And lastly, when it comes to land systems, we have options for adaptation based on nature or on ecosystems, both for agricultural systems as well as forest systems. So we have agroforestry, for example, irrigation, efficient irrigation, better water management. But what we find here, and I think all of my other colleagues have already mentioned, is that we need to work in an integrated way, meaning we can't, for example, just work on agriculture on the one hand, and then forests on the other, and then water separately, because but rather it all needs to be integrated. Also bearing in mind that if we don't do it in an integrated way, or for example, we don't take into account indigenous knowledge or local populations, or we plant different kinds of tree or vegetation that isn't appropriate, we can lead to misadaptation. And in this scenario, we can actually increase vulnerability of both of people and of ecosystems. So the use of nature as a way of adapting is there is evidence in the report that it is effective, that it is feasible, but also, as is the case of many other options, effectiveness will decrease as the levels of warming increase throughout the planet. Thank you. Thank you very much, Deborah, for illustrating such an important issue for us. And now I would like to go on to questions that are arriving from the audience that is listening to us. The first question is, are there is there are there data in the region on human migrations caused by climate change impacts? So here let you all participate freely. Go ahead, please. Well, I can start if you would allow me, because it just so happens that I came in from to this activity because I came from another one organized by the International Organization for Migration, where we were talking about migration and climate change, and we had a panel of experts on this topic. And basically the conclusion was that we still need more information. And this is partly because the link between climate or environment and migration is a complex link. The migration, we know, is a multi-causal phenomenon. We know that economic conditions are the chief cause of having people decide to migrate, but we do observe that there are impacts in migration due to extreme events. The problem oftentimes has been that the methodology for gathering data hasn't been adequate, or even the level of data gathering has not been adequate. We don't have, say, enough projects producing information on this topic to be able to answer the question. And nevertheless, the report that has been published already shows evidence that there is a link between climate change and migration, although the link still seems to have a medium confidence level, precisely due to the lack of literature. So what we would hope in this, at any rate, is that with this report now, with the interest that has been seen regionally and globally on migration, we can have financing so that science can create better data along these lines. Another point that was emphasized in the previous seminar that I participated in was that in many of our regions, for example, Central America, surely in the islands, the Caribbean, have similar stories. Climate information, historical climate information is very um, scarce. So we have few weather stations. We have few years of weather history, of climate history. So oftentimes the baseline that we uh, can use to compare what's happening currently is hard to establish. So in general, in conclusion, the region shows deficiencies when it comes to generating data, when it comes to producing information in this sense of climate change and migration, but evidence does point to there being that link. Obviously, uh, bearing understanding with the understanding that climate change, what climate change is doing is amplifying other socioeconomic conditions that make it so that the populations decide to migrate. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Una pregunta que
I have a question that we've received also, well, on the impact of this report in itself. Like, how can we put science, which is behind these recommendations and everything that you've been writing? So, how can we make this science be the driver for decision making that promotes this much needed social and economic transformation in the region? I don't know who dares maybe take on this question.
I can start, and then my other colleagues can join in. So what we did is we produced a summary for policymakers, and so embedded in that report, which was approved last week Saturday, would have been the science informing policymakers of how they can mainstream the science into policymaking and decision making. So in other words, what we have done is we have produced a product out of a bigger scientific report. That product is known as a summary for policymakers, and it actually involved a process of engagement with governments, over 200 governments around the globe, who would have endorsed the science and how it would have distilled and found its way into the summary for policymakers. So it is now up to the policymakers to use that product to inform their decision making, their budgeting for projects, for engagement with key stakeholders, to access financing globally, etc. So there is a nexus between the science and how it has dovetailed with the policy landscape, so to speak. Thank you.
Si me permiten complementar la respuesta
If I
de
may be
Michelle.
allowed to just complement, just to build on Michelle's answer, I wanted to just say two things. So number one, she emphasized the summary for decision makers, which is the only part of the text that is translated to all UN languages, including Spanish. It is the document that is the most distributed and the one that comes that reaches all decision makers. But the chapter on Central and South America of the report currently and normally is usually left only in English. So we have talked to several authors on this chapter, and with other international institutions on the possibility of translating that chapter to local languages, Spanish, Portuguese, at the least, so that we can cover most of the populations in our region. So on the one hand, something as simple as having the information in the language of the country helps tremendously. And secondly, the other issue that will be that of maintaining this process of communication at all levels, communicating it to decision makers, but also communicating it to the population at large, because at the end of the day, it is the population at large that will be able to ask their authorities to take all of this information into account in order to better face these situations. So again, as I already pointed out before, I think that the report has an enormous amount of important information. Now, the challenge is to make sure that that information reaches all people, and specifically in this case, that it reaches decision makers. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, go ahead. I had a That was actually a very good question, and well, like Michelle said, one of the most important parts of this is communication. It's how we communicate the results and who we communicate these results to. Of course, the most important part of the IPCC work is this summary for decision makers. But there are also other parts that, like Edwin mentioned, that unfortunately are left in English, and there is a traditional part which is answers the frequently asked questions part, and so we also need the help of social movements here and of organized movements, particularly these some of these movements that work with informing the results, and to have there be this relationship that Edwin described, from local communities all the way to their decision makers at every level, because the report also points out that there is a need for coordination uh, amongst the various decision levels, not just nationally, but also regionally and also locally, and as far as political organization within each of the nations. So that was just to add to that. Thank you. No, thank you very much. And so now we've received a whole lot of questions, but the last one would be, over the last few years, we have managed to have more authors from Latin America to participate, to be able to balance the overall report and the evidence from our region. Has there been a balance? It's a question. Well, maybe I can start, and then my colleagues can add to what I say. I would like to mention that it could be the case that yes, that representation in the region has increased, but not enough just yet, and especially in regions that are traditionally less underrepresented, we still have limited representation. In the specific case of Central America, it is we practically don't have large representation. In Guatemala, Debbie lives in Guatemala, even though even though she's from Mexico, she's an adoptive Guatemalan, and can testify that there is a need for participation of countries where science hasn't been strongly developed. So, for example, even in South America, it is easy to find authors from scientifically large countries, Brazil, Argentina, right? But other countries, smaller countries, Ecuador, Paraguay, are not are not represented amongst authors. So definitely, it is still a challenge to achieve this participation, and this participation is born from governments. We have to remember that we don't request participation. It was our governments as focal points, the ones who nominated them. So if the governments in our regions don't take an interest in nominating authors, we won't have these authors. So the call there is to have governments, which are the focal points that represent the IPCC, to have them be interested in making these nominations. Thank you. Thank you, Edwin. So Deborah and then Michelle, please. I thank you. Just to complement what Edwin mentioned under authorship, I think there are regions that have much more representation, but I also wanted to focus on the literature itself. There is a dearth of literature on the region. So when coming up with when carrying out studies, for example, to look at where there is adaptation or what the impacts on a particular sector are vis-a-vis another one, the region is very underrepresented. It's hard to find literature specific to that region. So creating that information and that science is also necessary. Another thing is that in order to participate in the IPCC, there are other ways. One is by writing the articles, the science that is used for these assessments. The other is to you can be an expert reviewer, because the IPCC publishes there are two expert review periods within the development period of the report, and in that part there's also the possibility to have experts in the region participate. And then another part is as contributing authors, and a contributing author is when there is a need for an expert on the issue within the list of authors of a chapter, and the author, the contributing author, writes one or two paragraphs on that issue. So I think that in addition to needing more representation from Central and South America and the Caribbean, and within these reports, we also need a larger amount of science and of publications. Thank you.
Yes, so if I can jump in here and complement what my other colleagues, Debbie and Edmund, have said. The IPCC selects its authors based on nominations from their governments. So it's up to our governments to identify the key people who can be applicants and be nominated to represent their region. As Debbie has mentioned, there is a process through which the authorship team is composed. And so in terms of authorship composition, it's in fact the first time in IPCC's history that we have the highest percentage of women working on the IPCC report. So that's a major milestone in terms of diversity, in terms of gender. And the other way is that through the contributing authors, we get that kind of diversity from the regions, both in terms of gender and representation from the various geographic regions. And I can speak for the small island states. The small island states chapter actually had the highest percentage of women in the whole of the IPCC chapters as contributing authors. And I actually was very strategic in identifying a new generation of scientists and scholars to take up the baton to move into the assessment 7. And so I'm in the Caribbean, I am well aware of the many young Caribbean scholars. And so I was able to call on them as contributing authors to engage them in the process. So I think the region, Latin America and the Caribbean, is looking good going into the next assessment 7 if we continue to groom and mentor these young scholars and scientists. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Carlos, adelante.
Gracias. Sí.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, just to kind of highlight a couple of things. So for authors from the region, I mean that the ratio can be improved, but also like Michelle was saying, we need to set milestone. And group 2, we've set a milestone in group 2, and we're talking about a gender participation of over 30% women. So, however, it is still improvable, and so there we need to ask governments to nominate more authors from the region and to allow for an equitable application process, and also to, even though these populations are usually, even though nominations are chiefly done by governments, there are observing agencies, organizations, and so any organization that does science around climate change in the region can request to be an observing organization within the IPCC so as to be able to have the right to not to have authors from that organization apply, and or these organizations can have their members apply to be authors. So just to add that, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Carlos, when Michelle, uh, uh, for your time and for such a synthetic and complete vision on what this report is telling us from work group 2 of the IPCC. I would like to remind those who are listening to us that this is the beginning of a series of 3 additional sessions that we'll be developing over the next 3 or 4 weeks to go deeper into specific sections of this report so that it's so, so that a lack of information doesn't keep us from making decisions. As we've heard, discrimination, and it's important for this report to create action, concrete action out in the on the ground, given this dramatic call to action. So without further ado, please be attentive to this space so that you can receive new invitations to go deeper into these issues. And also the third report, so this is report 6 for the IPCC, we're gonna hold a specific section together with IPCC to be able to detail specifications for Latin America and the Caribbean. And without further ado, I'd like to let Piedad Martin, our regional director, our adjunct regional director, so for the UN Environment Program. Thank you, Gustavo. Good day, good afternoon to everybody with us today. A warm greeting to our panelists. Once again, the IPCC comes to alert us that climate change is already here and that unfortunately it's here to stay. It's a reality, and hence the importance, the unavoidable importance of adaptation. But the report also, again, gives us clear information that sustainable development patterns we currently have, based characterized by poverty, lack of governance, and lack of democratic participation, and the unsustainable use of land and oceans, is increasing the vulnerability of people and ecosystems to climate change. It's an inextricable relationship, as our panelists have mentioned, and to avoid further loss of life and biodiversity and infrastructure, we need to have these measures be immediate and more ambitious, and to have a quick, pronounced reduction of greenhouse gas emissions that could create scenarios that could be worse. So adaptation saves lives, and before we get to irreversible thresholds, which can lead to loss of wildlife and food sources, and so that, this relationship between human beings and nature has been clearly laid out. Michelle Michael indicated to us the urgent situation of the islands and coastal areas where, in addition to the impacts that are already being seen, there is a fear of future risks that are becoming amplified. Projections indicate that these islands are and will be strongly affected by floods and cyclones, which is an enormous risk for a population that is very close to and very concentrated precisely around the coastal rims, as well as infrastructure that is placed there. So this is a huge challenge that they share in the report. Also, Edwin Castellanos mentioned that climate projections for the Central America region also show worrisome precipitation reports and increase of desertification, and that it is very likely that the dry corridor region that is affecting so many vulnerable people becomes extended and affects an even greater number of people. So in this region, it is key that at the local level, water shortages are addressed, and to have more storage and collection equipment be installed. And I thought that the specific consideration of cities was very important, given that the region is the second most urbanized in the world, but always keeping the rural areas in mind. So Carlos has mentioned to us that any measure will include careful planning that will guarantee social inclusiveness and care of ecosystems, and that there is an excellent opportunity for adaptation, for the focus on adaptation of cities and with a strong social component, and to have us financing to be able to have effective effective adaptation measures. Unfortunately, a lot of these adaptation efforts are dispersed. A lot of them are pilots and they're not insufficient. So the gaps between what is already being seen and the needs are larger and larger because climate change is accelerating these impacts. So it's important also to have commitment, focus on action. To answer these challenges, I think that the panel has agreed that the government and the private sector, civil society, and the international community must join forces, and that they need to have clear, reliable information, such as the IPCC, that which the IPCC provides. Risks need to be identified, and that's why information is so important, and also participatory processes for the decision making and for how investments are carried out. It is important to recognize that, and it's been mentioned oftentimes, that the role that nature plays in as a potential way to sustainably address adaptation needs, both in rural contexts as well as urban ones. And it is important to emphasize nature-based adaptation and to mobilize around having this shift in paradigm and to have climate resilient development that entails economic adaptations, but also political and social means. It's a matter of survival, as you mentioned at the beginning. And lastly, I would like to say that today's panel all agree on the importance of having scientific information to be able to inform decision making and avoiding non-adaptation or an increase in vulnerability. But it's also been pointed out that Latin America and the Caribbean have other gaps, such as access to sanitation, institutional LACs, wants to be able to achieve effective organizations. So policies, both local, regional, and national, and including also national ones, as well as allowing women and indigenous populations, all stakeholders and all social groups and all sectors will be key to this purpose. And so without further ado, then I'd like to thank all our panelists, the IPCC team and the UN Environmental Program, and all of you who are so committed to climate change and to climate action and who have been with us today. And we hope you will join us in future spaces that we will be opening. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Piedad, for such a relevant summary for the observations of this panel. And we would like to call on all of you to be on the lookout for our future announcements, where we will be going into further detail on what this report is telling us from working group 2 from the IPCC. So thank you to everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you to all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Adiós.
Gracias.
Gracias,
Hasta
buen
luego.
día.
Gracias.
Bye-bye.